Welcome to Schema Stories. My name is Martha Van Berkel, and I'm the CEO at Schema App. And I'm absolutely delighted today to bring you an interview with Bill Slawski. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Now, Bill, I love reading your articles and how you get so deep into the patterns and try to connect the dots for those of us that aren't reading those technical documents. And so I'm really excited for you to share your view on schema markup today and sort of where you think search is going.
I started looking at the patents because I was curious about how things worked, and I wasn't getting answers from most things I saw on the web. So sometimes we do see some really in-depth, detailed information from Google's developer pages, and sometimes they promise those things and we don't see them. For instance, when they first introduced Google Lens at the Google I/O 2018 Developers Conference, they mentioned that they would be putting more information on developers' pages about how Lens uses schema after it recognizes objects in pictures. It would tell us if the picture was a picture of a band, for instance, it would look for a schema markup that might be event-based and might tell us where the band was performing next. But we haven't seen that from developers' pages yet. So I've been relegated to looking for patents that might include that.
Love it. That's awesome. Well, why don't we start by tell us a bit about yourself and what you do in search.
Okay, I've been working in different agencies and as a solo practitioner since 1996. I worked in-house for a company that helped people incorporate in Delaware for a number of years. I started getting into forums, administrating and moderating forums, and kept on running into a lot of the same questions over and over and over again. How do I increase my page rank? What goes into page rank? Why can't Google read pictures of text? No, they probably can, but it's just something they don't do. It's too computatively expensive for them to do. So if you don't write something out in text to include your address on your page, if you take a picture of text, you design a logo that has your address in it that isn't text, Google doesn't know where you're at. Shame, but okay. So I'm telling you more about myself. I work with an agency called Go Fish Digital. They're located on the East Coast. I'm on the West Coast. I'm sort of like the satellite exploring. We do have some clients on the West Coast. I don't get to spend too much time going face-to-face with them, but it's good to be out here. I'm in the same time zone, and they know they can catch up to me at the same time of day if it's later in the afternoon or so on, which makes it convenient for them and for me.
Excellent. And can you tell me, like, in your journey around search and in your career, when did you first come across the semantic web or schema markup? How did you first sort of come across that or be introduced to it?
I read something I wrote in 2013. I had gone through my previous posts to see how often I mentioned certain topics and noticed that I'd mentioned the word entities in about 20% of my posts. So it's something I've always been writing about, the Internet of Things instead of strings, right? And I think a lot of that's because I do write about patents, and there have been a number of patents from Google that talk about entities and named entities and so on. The people I'm working with now on the East Coast, I met at an SEO meetup, one where I was talking about named entities, which is kind of funny. It's been useful for some of the projects we've worked on. For instance, we worked with an apartment complex in Northern Virginia that was only 4 pages long. They were trying to sell apartments. They hadn't been having much luck. We started working with them, improving their site, bringing up things on their pages that they didn't include like the fact that if you took an elevator down to the basement, it opened up to the DC Metro, which like allows you to commute everywhere in Northern Virginia, DC, and Southern Maryland. You can go to 31 different Smithsonian institutes, which don't charge admission. So if you have kids and need things to do on the weekend and you live in these apartments, you can bring kids to the Smithsonian's for pretty much the cost of hopping on the subway, on the metro.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And can you talk to me? Some people listening may not know what a named entity is. Can you maybe define that a little further for us?
Sure. Okay. An entity is a particular person, place, or thing. A named entity is when you're talking about a specific person, place, or thing. So if you are talking about restaurants, those are entities. You talk about the restaurant down the street from you, it's a named entity because it's a specific entity. When Google talks about local search, they pretty much created a search that's based upon semantics, based upon entities and schema markup. You don't need to use schema markup on your pages. You don't even need to have a website to have a listing in Google Maps. But it's probably smart too. They've been using schema more and more, and schema's been growing a lot too. They've been including new things in it. There is an extension process for schema markup where people can submit new topics and expand how schema what it covers, how it works, and so on. And they're using it in new ways. One of the things I saw recently was CNBC stating that they received notification from Google that they could create how-to advertisements where they could describe how to do certain things and pay for the right to have those published, sort of as opposed to people receiving featured snippets. They would receive how-to advertisements.
Very interesting. Speaking, you think of extensions. I know the IoT extension is something that was announced sort of in the last release of schema.org. One of the questions we had is like, this is all changing and it's changing fast. And we're seeing, as you said, those new examples of how it's being used in paid search that you brought up. And actually, I brought up in a conversation I had with someone from Google Canada this week. Where do you see this going? And like, I think maybe more importantly, like, what are you most excited about in the evolving area of search?
Okay, one of the typical things we think of when we think about how a search engine crawls the web, like Googlebot, is it follows links from page to page. It indexes the content of those pages and the anchor text of those links and where the links go, if they redirect, and so on. An alternative to that, something that's been referred to as open learning on the web, is that Google reads pages like it was a person. It tries to understand what's being talked about, what topics are being covered. We used to have DMOZ, which used to be a starting point for focus crawls on the web when a search engine wanted to crawl the web and learn about different topics, because they could follow categories from DMOZ and to links to pages. And that would give them coverage for the search engine. So they would cover lots of topics instead of just being very focused on a few things. So with this open learning on the web, it's something that was developed by a company called Wavy, which was out of the University of Washington and headed by an AI researcher by the name of Oren Etzioni. I think I pronounced his name right. I'm not sure. He works for Paul Allen's AI Institute at this point in time. But Google acquired the technology from them. They're doing more crawling of facts on the web, which they issued a paper in 2014 called Bipedpedia, which talks about how they might use query streams to learn about what people are searching for when they search for different topics. And they're extracting information from crawling of facts on the web based upon what they're learning from those query streams. So it helps them build ontologies about different topics on the web that they can use to answer questions when they do question answering, when they try to show featured snippets. And we're moving in that direction where the web is becoming a big database. The very second patent Google filed with the United States Patent Office was one Sergey Brin wrote. He came up with an algorithm called DPRA. It doesn't have quite the ring of PageRank. It's not BrinRank like he didn't name it after himself like Larry did with the first patent. But it was a list of 5 books, their authors, their publishers, their publication dates. And he said, if we crawl the web, find these 5 books listed and information about them like we have here for these books, we can crawl all the other books that are in the same location, collect information about them, and then keep on repeating that. And next thing you know, we know where all the books on the web are.
How is this going to change like how as an organization you manage your data? Do you think it will have an impact in how we explain who we are and what we do and sort of the knowledge we have in our organizations?
It changes around the way search works because it looks to properties of entities, information about them that people can search for. Entities include local entities like businesses. So we can search for something like a Chinese restaurant near a bookstore. And so we can go find something to read and something to eat during the same lunch period, right?
I always talk about it's like how it's crawling the graph and connecting those dots. So it knows that the bookstore is at this address, it knows the Chinese store is at this address, and so therefore and that the bookstore sells books and the Chinese store sells Chinese food, and therefore can connect those dots across, right?
So I did have a job in a courthouse where my supervisor liked to go on shopping trips and sometimes asked me to make maps for her using Google so that she could tell how to go from one shopping center to another to another. Not something Google does easily. Sometimes they made that a little bit easier to do than other times. They've changed it around a few times.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, one of the other types of queries we're seeing based on semantic approaches are things like, what was that movie that Robert Duvall said, I love the smell of napalm in the morning? And it's not necessarily asking for a web page that shows the names Robert Duvall or that quote or whatever, but it's asking about facts and properties and what movie was acted in by Robert Duvall, what included that quote from him. And the answer, the search results show 2 video clips from Apocalypse Now at the top of the results with Robert Duvall in them saying, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Now, I bring up Robert Duvall because he lived about half an hour north of me when I lived in Virginia a few years ago. And he was really involved in charities and things like that.
Very cool. Also, in that result is interesting because it doesn't necessarily give the answer, but a video, right? So there's a whole other inferring going on there around, the content of the video and the entities and the properties within that video, right? Which is sort of taking it to that next step.
So I got into doing stuff with entities because I was working on the Baltimore.org website. And we were trying to rank pages for things like Best Bar in Baltimore, Black History in Baltimore, was one they wanted to rank for. We tried it, and there were too many well-done Black History Baltimore-based websites to rank well. We weren't getting past 100 or so in Google's rankings. So I sent a copywriter I was working with an instant messages saying, could you write something that describes a walking tour of Baltimore from one place to another that mentions the famous historic churches, the colleges, the people, there's a 9-foot tall...
The entities, right?
That's right. There's a 9-foot tall statue of Billie Holiday in downtown Baltimore. There's a 7-house mansion from Frederick Douglass. As he aged, he started out life as a slave, and he escaped. He made lots of money. He moved back to Baltimore, bought a lot of property there, and did well. You can visit these places. You can see them. And that was the purpose behind the Baltimore.org website, to get people to travel to Baltimore and see it. Mm-hmm. So by creating a page that had about 5,000 words on it about different entities whom you could visit in person as you came to Baltimore, we were helping them fulfill the mission of their site.
Awesome. Which actually kind of leads me into my next question. And I always ask, like, in a couple sentences or maybe 2 sentences, can you articulate what you think the value is to organizations or companies for doing schema markup? Like, what do you think the tangible outcomes are?
If you use structured data, you're presenting more precise information to a search engine using data in formats that they expect people to use to search for, like you would with keyword research. Okay, schema means schema like in a database schema, how a database is organized. So if you're using the right words as determined by people who make schema, who are subject matter experts, you're most likely using terms that people will search for, that they expect to see on pages that they find, which is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I've been talking to a couple customers recently about how schema.org vocabulary is actually insight into what the search engines want to know about different entities, and that you can use it to understand that dictionary that you're talking about.
Right.
And so if you actually think of it as input into your content planning, it can be really insightful and also help with performance and understanding as you go through that content development process.
I've tried to explain that to copywriters too.
Mm-hmm. I had a couple of people click last week, so I was excited to kind of see them, how they think it's more than just technical SEO, right? But how it really can play a role in the planning and strategy stage. So let's talk a little bit about the future, because you have these insights into sort of how Google thinks through your research and reading and experience. In my last interview, I talked to Steve Macbeth at Microsoft, and he was talking about how in his role in AI, they're thinking about using schema to connect virtual reality with reality, similar to what you were talking about earlier with Google Lens. Do you see any new consumers coming up sort of beyond the organic search or assistance or now these sort of virtual reality? Where do you think that sort of next consumer of schema markup is going to come from?
Are you familiar with machine IDs?
I'm not. Tell me more.
Okay, when Google acquired MetaWeb, they acquired Freebase, and Freebase would give entities machine IDs. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, for instance, had one long string of letters and numbers that stood for Arnold Schwarzenegger. So
this is like the Wikidata number that we have, like sort of that came from Freebase?
It's like the Wikidata number that came from, if you do a search at Google Trends for an entity, like Chicago Cubs or something like that, mm-hmm. you see a type that's something other than search type. If you see like Chicago Cubs, you look for it says baseball team. So it's a type. So it's recognizing Chicago Cubs as an entity. If you look at the URL, the last few letters and numbers of the URL are the machine ID number for
Very
Chicago
cool.
Cubs. Okay, so that's used in Google Trends to help track entities. It's used in Google did a blog post on reverse image search where they said
Mm-hmm.
they're using machine IDs to track entities in images. So when you do a search for an entity as an image of an entity, it's using machine ID numbers to help it find that, which ties into the Google Lens use of schema to find entities.
And are these, do you think, like the entity nodes within the knowledge graph from Google's perspective, or are these like more global standard entity IDs that can be used like from a sort of more data commons or sort of open data stance?
There's sort of like a shortcut Google is using for, they're doing search engine optimization too, but they're actually optimizing the search engine. They're trying to make it quicker for them. So if you search for Arnold Schwarzenegger, they say, oh, that's this string of numbers and letters. So that's all mentions of Kindergarten Cop, all mentions of the Terminator, of different roles that he's played. They know that's the same person, the same entity.
And is that something you think that brands can control? So if I'm, Kellogg, could I actually start sort of helping define that if I'm managing my schema markup and knowledge graph?
Okay, so Google I/O 2013, they came out with something they called the invisible same as, which meant that they could use a link element instead of an anchor element for a link, as something you could use to show that an entity you're talking about is the same as something that maybe you see in Wikipedia or something. So I had a client who was an app developer who came up with a payment app. They were started by Sprint, Verizon, and AT&T. So they were on most of the Android phones in the US because those are pretty big carriers. And they were putting a link. Okay, so the company, when we worked with them, their name had changed. They were originally known as ISIS, which maybe you don't necessarily want to be known as an app company because it sounds a lot like a paramilitary group from the Mideast. Okay, so I started to do an audit for them. And one of the things I suggested was they use this invisible same as, which was described at the Google I/O conference by a couple of Google developers. Figured Google wouldn't have a problem with that because it's something they came up with. Okay. So every time on their website they call themselves ISIS, they would use the same as link to their Wikipedia page, which shows that they've changed names from ISIS to their new name. Okay, which meant they weren't paramilitary group. Google could distinguish them from the guys in the Middle East. So they never implemented that because Google bought the company 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after I sent them the audit. So I missed the chance to go over that with them.
But now we actually see that in sort of the general schema markup, right? Where you can use same as, most people use it for social media, but how you can also use it for stronger relationships, right? So if you're changing brands, who you were and what it is, as well as alternate names, et cetera, right?
Right. You can, and they remarked that you can use that in JSON to have it show in your knowledge panel.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, one last question, and then we're going to wrap up because we're out of time. So,
Okay.
what now? I look to you in a lot of your articles to stay on top of things that are changing, especially again looking at some of the things that we don't see sort of publicly and some of the public documentation from the search engines. Who are people you follow and watch to stay on top of trends or that are inspiring you sort of in your work?
It's a good question. I tend to, I have a very large SEO list on Twitter, and I read through that usually a couple times a day because you never quite know what people might post from there.
Hmm.
And there are SEOs from around the country, around the world. Uh, I've made a couple of other lists like that. I have a machine intelligence uh, and a deep learning list and a search engine list. And I find that it's helpful to look to those and see uh, what people are talking about because people do announce a lot of new things there.
Hmm. Yeah, I absolutely love following the conversation, especially again for thought leaders sort of around the world and in different areas of specialty. And it's always fun also sometimes when they throw in non-search related things, so you get to know them as a person as well.
That does make it fun. Yeah.
So, Bill, thank you so much for your time. If people wanted to find you online, what's the best way for them to find you?
They can find me on Twitter. I spend a lot of time there. I do blog at my own website, which is SEO by the Sea. I blog at the Go Fish Digital website. Uh, I had been doing some writing for some other sites. I don't do that quite as often because the Go Fish Digital site and the SEO by the Sea site keep me busy enough.
Excellent.
Uh,
Well,
mm,
I'll put those links in for our listeners and for the people watching the interview. And again, heartfelt thank you for spending time with us today and sharing your insights. I look forward to continuing to see you in the Twitterdom as well as reading your ongoing articles as you go deep into sort of how things are changing from a machine learning and a semantic web. So thanks so much for your time today.
you're welcome. Thank you.